Karoline Leavitt grew up in a quiet little town in New Hampshire, where everyone knew each other by name. She was the kind of person who always stood out, not because she shouted the loudest, but because she worked the hardest. From a young age, Karoline dreamed of becoming a lawyer. It wasn't about the fancy suits or courtroom drama. It was about making things fair. She believed that justice should be blind, treating everyone equally no matter their background. Her journey wasn't easy. Coming from a modest family, she had to juggle part-time jobs while studying law. Friends would often ask her why she pushed herself so hard. "Because someone has to," she'd reply with a smile. And that's exactly what she did. After years of struggle, Karoline finally earned her degree and started working at a small law firm. Her colleagues admired her dedication, and soon enough she began gaining respect in the legal community. But life has a way of testing even the strongest people. One day, Karoline took on a case that seemed ordinary at first glance. A local business owner claimed they were being unfairly targeted by a judge during a property dispute. At first, Karoline thought it was just another routine case, digging through documents, finding loopholes and presenting arguments. But as she dug deeper, something felt off. There were inconsistencies in the paperwork, strange delays in court decisions, and whispers among staff about the judge's behavior. Curiosity turned into suspicion when Karoline stumbled upon some old files hidden away in the courthouse archives. These weren't just random papers. They were proof of something much bigger. Transactions, emails, and notes suggested that the judge, a man respected by many, might have been involved in corruption. He wasn't just bending the rules, he was breaking them for personal gain. Karoline couldn't believe it. How could someone sworn to uphold justice do such a thing? She knew exposing this wouldn't be easy. This wasn't just any judge. It was someone powerful, well-connected, and used to getting his way. Still, Karoline felt a responsibility to act. If she didn't, who would? So she gathered all the evidence she could find, carefully documenting every detail. Late nights became her norm as she pieced together the puzzle, driven by the hope that truth would prevail. But then came the twist no one saw coming. Instead of addressing the allegations, the judge struck back. Suddenly, Karoline found herself under attack. Accusations flew left and right. She was accused of falsifying evidence, tampering with records, and trying to ruin the judge's reputation. What started as an effort to bring justice turned into a nightmare. Her credibility was shattered overnight. Colleagues distanced themselves, fearing backlash if they supported her. Even her own law firm asked her to step down, saying it was for the best. It was like watching her world crumble around her. The very system she believed in had turned its back on her. Without a license to practice law, Karoline felt lost. Bills piled up and the stress weighed heavily on her shoulders. Some days she wondered if fighting was worth it. Wasn't it easier to let go, move on, and start over somewhere else? But deep down, she knew she couldn't. Giving up would mean letting the judge win, and worse, it would mean betraying everything she stood for. So, despite the odds stacked against her, Karoline made a decision. She wouldn't stop until the truth came out. Little did she know, this decision would set her on a path filled with challenges, sacrifices, and ultimately, redemption. For now, though, all she had was determination, and the faint glimmer of hope that someday, justice would find its way back to her. This version keeps the tone conversational and relatable, focusing on human emotions and experiences to keep the audience engaged. Let me know if you'd like me to expand further or adjust anything. After losing everything, her career, her reputation, and the trust of people she once called friends, Karoline hit rock bottom. For weeks, she stayed indoors, barely eating or sleeping. Every time she turned on the news, there was another headline about how disgraced attorney Karoline Leavitt had tried to ruin a respected judge's life. It felt like the whole world had turned against her. Friends stopped calling, neighbors avoided eye contact, and even family members seemed unsure what to say. The loneliness was suffocating. But one morning, as sunlight streamed through her window, something inside Karoline shifted. She realized sitting around feeling sorry for herself wasn't going to change anything. If she wanted justice, she'd have to fight for it, not just for herself but for everyone else who might suffer under a corrupt system. That day she made a promise to herself. No matter how long it took, she would clear her name and expose the truth. The problem was, where do you even start when you're broke, discredited, and alone? Karoline knew she needed money to survive, let alone fund a legal battle against someone as powerful as the judge. So, she swallowed her pride and started taking whatever jobs she could find. During the day, she worked at a local cafe, serving coffee to people who didn't recognize her, or worse, did recognize her and whispered behind her back. At night, she cleaned offices, mopping floors and emptying trash cans while most people were asleep. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept food on the table and gave her time to focus on her real mission. Late at night, after her shifts ended, Karoline would sit at her kitchen table surrounded by piles of papers, books, and notes. She pored over every piece of evidence she had collected before her license was revoked. Some nights, frustration got the better of her. The documents felt incomplete, the connections unclear. How could she prove what she suspected without access to official records or witnesses willing to testify? But then she'd remind herself why she was doing this. Giving up wasn't an option. One evening, as she scrolled through online forums, looking for advice, she stumbled upon a post written by a retired investigative journalist. The article detailed years of exposing corruption in government institutions. Something about the writer's words resonated with Karoline. Desperate for help, she decided to reach out. To her surprise, the journalist, a gruff but kind-hearted man named Thomas Reed, replied within hours. Intrigued by her story, he agreed to meet her for coffee. Their first meeting was awkward. Karoline wasn't used to asking for help, especially from strangers. But as she explained her situation, showing him the evidence she had gathered, Thomas leaned forward, his eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "You've got guts," he said finally. "Most people would have walked away by now." From that moment, they became an unlikely team. Thomas brought decades of experience uncovering scandals, while Karoline provided first-hand knowledge of the case and an unshakable determination to see it through. Together, they began digging deeper. Thomas taught Karoline how to track down obscure public records, interview reluctant sources, and spot patterns others might miss. Slowly, but surely, the pieces of the puzzle started coming together. They uncovered fraudulent transactions hidden in plain sight, emails revealing coordinated efforts to silence critics, and even a list of past victims too afraid to speak out. Each new discovery fueled Karoline's resolve, but it also came with risks. The judge wasn't going to sit idly by while they built their case. Threats started arriving. Anonymous letters slipped under her door, menacing phone calls late at night, and even warnings left on her car windshield. One message simply read, "Stop digging or else." Fear crept in, but Karoline refused to let it control her. Instead, she installed extra locks on her doors, changed her phone number, and carried pepper spray everywhere she went. She knew the stakes were high, but backing down wasn't an option. As months turned into years, Karoline's life revolved around two things: surviving and preparing for the fight of her life. She saved every penny she earned, knowing she'd need it for court fees. She rehearsed arguments in front of the mirror, imagining how the judge's lawyers might try to discredit her. And whenever doubt crept in, she reminded herself of the people counting on her, the ones who couldn't stand up for themselves. Then, one cold winter morning, it happened. After years of relentless effort, Karoline and Thomas finally had enough evidence to file a lawsuit against the judge. Sitting in a dingy office above the cafe where she worked, Karoline signed the paperwork with trembling hands. It was a small act, but it marked the beginning of a new chapter, one where she would either reclaim her honor or face complete ruin. Filing the lawsuit didn't bring immediate relief. In fact, it only intensified the pressure. Reporters hounded her for statements, and skeptics dismissed her claims as revenge-seeking nonsense. Even some of her old colleagues doubted whether she could pull it off. But Karoline didn't care what anyone thought anymore. All that mattered was getting her day in court and proving, once and for all, that truth still mattered. As she walked home that evening, snow crunching beneath her boots, Karoline allowed herself a rare moment of hope. The road ahead would be long and brutal, but for the first time in years, she felt like she was moving forward instead of standing still. Justice might be blind, but Karoline was determined to make sure it wasn't deaf to the cries of those betrayed by power. This version expands on Karoline's struggles and resilience, keeping the tone natural and relatable. Let me know if you'd like adjustments or further expansion. The day finally came. After years of preparation, sleepless nights, and relentless determination, Karoline Leavitt stepped into the courtroom for what would become one of the most talked-about trials in recent history. Cameras lined the hallways outside, reporters jostling for position to get a glimpse of her as she walked in. Some called it the trial of the century, not just because of the staggering $800 million at stake, but because it pitted an ordinary woman against a towering figure of authority, a judge who had spent decades building his reputation as untouchable. Karoline didn't look like someone ready to take on the world that morning. She wore a simple black suit, her hair pulled back neatly, and carried a stack of files so thick it looked like they might topple over. Her face was calm, but if you looked closely, you could see the faint tremble in her hands. This wasn't just another case. It was her life's work, her redemption, and her last chance to prove she wasn't the liar everyone had accused her of being. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere buzzed with tension. On one side sat the defense team, a group of high-powered lawyers dressed sharply in expensive suits. They whispered among themselves, occasionally glancing at Karoline with smirks that said, "You don't stand a chance." Across from them was Karoline, flanked by Thomas Reed, the retired journalist who had become her closest ally. He wasn't a lawyer, but he knew how to tell a story, and this trial was shaping up to be the ultimate showdown between truth and power. As the judge overseeing the case, a different judge, thankfully, called the room to order, Karoline took a deep breath. She reminded herself why she was here. Not for revenge, not for money, but for justice. For all the people who had been silenced. For every time someone abused their power without consequences. And for the young girl in New Hampshire who once dreamed of making the world fairer. The prosecution started strong. The opposing counsel launched into an opening statement filled with grandiose language, painting Karoline as a disgruntled ex-lawyer seeking vengeance. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, pacing dramatically across the floor, "this case is nothing more than a personal vendetta. Ms. Leavitt has made wild accusations without evidence, dragging a respected public servant through the mud for her own gain." Karoline clenched her fists under the table but kept her composure. When it was her turn to speak, she stood slowly, her voice steady despite the nerves bubbling inside her. "This isn't about me," she said, looking directly at the jury. "It's about holding someone accountable when they abuse the trust we place in them. It's about protecting the system we rely on to keep us safe and fair." Her words resonated. You could feel the shift in the room as people leaned forward, listening intently. Over the next few weeks, Karoline presented her case piece by piece, laying out the mountain of evidence she and Thomas had painstakingly gathered. There were bank statements showing suspicious transactions, emails revealing attempts to manipulate court decisions, and even recordings of conversations where the accused judge admitted to pressuring others to stay quiet. One of the most explosive moments came when a former clerk from the judge's office agreed to testify. This person had been too afraid to come forward before, fearing retaliation. But now, sitting in the witness box, they described how the judge routinely demanded favors in exchange for favorable rulings. He called it keeping things running smoothly, the clerk said, visibly nervous but resolute. But it wasn't smooth, it was wrong. The courtroom erupted in murmurs each time new evidence was revealed. Even some of the jurors seemed shocked, exchanging glances as they scribbled notes furiously. Meanwhile, the defense team scrambled to counterattack, accusing Karoline of fabricating stories and twisting facts. At one point, they even tried to discredit her character, bringing up old rumors about her past failures, but Karoline didn't flinch. With every accusation thrown her way, she responded calmly, using logic and evidence to dismantle their arguments. Thomas played a crucial role during cross-examinations. Though he wasn't a trained lawyer, his years of investigative journalism gave him a knack for asking the right questions at the right time. More than once, he caught witnesses contradicting themselves or dodging answers, leaving the jury skeptical of the defense's claims. Outside the courtroom, the trial dominated headlines. People couldn't stop talking about it. Friends debated. Over dinner, strangers argued on social media, and late-night talk show hosts joked about the drama unfolding daily. Some supported Karoline, praising her courage and calling her a hero. Others dismissed her as delusional, convinced she was chasing fame or fortune. Through it all, Karoline stayed focused, refusing to let public opinion sway her. By the end of the trial, exhaustion had taken its toll. Dark circles formed under her eyes, and her hands bore the marks of countless hours gripping documents tightly. Yet, there was also a sense of peace. Whether she won or lost, she knew she had done everything in her power to expose the truth. As closing arguments approached, she prepared her final statement carefully, knowing these would be the last words the jury heard before deliberating. Standing before the court, Karoline spoke from the heart. "Justice isn't perfect," she said softly, her voice carrying through the silent room. "It doesn't always give us what we want, and sometimes it takes longer than it should. But justice exists because we believe in fairness. We believe that no matter how powerful someone is, they can't escape accountability forever. Today I ask you to honor that belief, not for me, but for everyone who trusts in the system to protect them." When she finished speaking, the courtroom remained eerily quiet. Even the defense lawyers looked uneasy, sensing the tide might be turning. As the judge instructed the jury to begin deliberations, Karoline returned to her seat, exhaling deeply. She had done all she could. Now it was out of her hands. Little did she know the verdict would change her life, and the lives of countless others, forever. This version builds suspense and keeps readers engaged with vivid descriptions and emotional depth. Let me know if you'd like further tweaks or expansions. The courtroom felt like it was holding its breath. After weeks of intense arguments, shocking revelations, and heated exchanges, the moment everyone had been waiting for finally arrived. The jury had reached a verdict. As the forepersons stood to deliver their decision, Karoline Leavitt sat perfectly still in her chair, her hands clasped tightly together on the table in front of her. She didn't dare look at the faces around her. The reporters scribbling notes, the spectators leaning forward in anticipation, or even Thomas Reed, who gave her shoulder a reassuring squeeze before sitting back down. "Ladies and gentlemen of the court," the foreperson began, his voice steady but echoing slightly in the tense silence. "On the charges brought forth by Ms. Karoline Leavitt against Judge Richard Hargrove, we find the defendant guilty." For a split second, there was no sound. Then, as if a dam had burst, the room erupted into chaos. Reporters shouted questions. Cameras flashed wildly and people jumped to their feet, some cheering while others looked stunned. Karoline remained frozen in her seat, unable to process what she'd just heard. Guilty. They had found him guilty. It wasn't just a win, it was validation. Everything she had fought for, every sacrifice she had made, had led to this moment. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them away quickly. Now wasn't the time to cry. Now was the time to stand tall. Slowly she rose from her seat, feeling the weight of the world lift off her shoulders. For years, she had carried the burden of being called a liar, a troublemaker, someone unworthy of trust. But today the truth had spoken louder than any accusation ever could. As the judge overseeing the case announced the damages, $800 million, the crowd gasped audibly. Even Karoline couldn't believe the number. It wasn't about the money, though. To her, that figure represented something far greater: accountability. A message sent loud and clear that no one, not even someone as powerful as a judge, was above the law. When the gavel came down, signaling the end of the trial, Karoline turned to face the gallery. Dozens of eyes were on her, some filled with admiration, others with disbelief. She spotted a few familiar faces, People who had doubted her, mocked her, or walked away when she needed support most. Yet here she was, standing victorious despite all odds. Her heart swelled with pride, not arrogance but gratitude for having seen this fight through to the end. Outside the courthouse, pandemonium reigned. News vans lined the streets, microphones stretched toward Karoline as reporters fired question after question. How does it feel to win? What will you do with the settlement? Do you have any regrets? Overwhelmed by the noise, Karoline raised a hand to quiet the crowd. When they settled down, she took a deep breath and spoke directly to the cameras. "This isn't my victory," she said firmly, her voice carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. "It's a victory for anyone who has ever felt powerless, for anyone who has been silenced or pushed aside because of someone else's greed or corruption. I didn't do this alone. I had help from people who believed in me when I barely believed in myself. And I hope this sends a message that justice can still be served, no matter how hard the fight may seem." Her words struck a chord. People cheered, clapping so loudly it drowned out the hum of traffic behind them. Some held signs reading, "Justice prevails," and "Truth wins," while others simply watched in awe, inspired by the woman who had refused to give up. Social media exploded with reactions, hashtags trending worldwide as millions tuned in to watch replays of the historic verdict. Strangers shared stories of their own battles against injustice, crediting Karoline with reigniting their faith in fairness. But amidst the celebration, Karoline stayed grounded. She knew the road ahead wouldn't magically become easy. Winning the lawsuit didn't erase the scars of the past, the sleepless nights, the lost friendships, the moments of doubt that had nearly broken her. Still, she allowed herself a brief moment of joy. That evening, as she sat alone in her tiny apartment surrounded by empty takeout containers and scattered papers, she let the tears flow freely. Not tears of sadness, but of relief. Finally, she could breathe again. Over the next few days, life changed dramatically for Karoline. Offers poured in, from book deals to speaking engagements to TV appearances. Everyone wanted a piece of her story. At first, she hesitated, unsure if stepping into the spotlight was the right move. But then she realized something important. Her platform could make a difference. If sharing her journey inspired even one person to keep fighting for what was right, it would be worth it. One of the first things she did was announce plans to use part of the settlement to create a foundation aimed at helping victims of judicial corruption. "I don't need $800 million, she told an interviewer during her first major television appearance. "No one needs that much money. What I want is to ensure no one else has to go through what I went through. If we can protect whistleblowers, support those fighting corrupt systems, and educate people about their rights, maybe we can prevent cases like mine in the future." The idea resonated deeply. Donations flooded in from supporters eager to contribute to the cause, and within months the foundation was up and running. It provided resources for individuals seeking legal redress, funded investigations into systemic abuses, and advocated for reforms to increase transparency in the judiciary. Karoline became its public face, traveling across the country to speak at conferences, schools, and community centers. Everywhere she went, people thanked her, not just for winning her case, but for reminding them that change was possible. Despite her newfound fame, Karoline never forgot where she came from. She returned to her hometown in New Hampshire frequently, visiting old friends and family members who had stuck by her side even when times were tough. Sitting around the kitchen table with her mom, sipping coffee and laughing about old memories, she often reflected on how far she'd come. Life hadn't turned out the way she'd imagined, but maybe that was okay. Sometimes the hardest paths lead to the most meaningful destinations. Still, not everyone celebrated her victory. Critics accused her of profiting off tragedy, questioning whether such a massive payout was justified. Others claimed she had exaggerated her struggles to gain sympathy. Karoline didn't waste energy responding to these comments. She knew controversy came with the territory, especially when challenging powerful institutions. Instead, she focused on the bigger picture, the ripple effect her case might have on the legal system and beyond. By the time the dust settled, Karoline found herself in a place she never thought she'd reach. Peace. Not the kind of peace that comes from avoiding conflict, but the kind born out of facing your fears head-on and emerging stronger on the other side. She had proven to herself, and to the world, that justice wasn't dead. It just needed people, brave enough to fight for it. And Karoline, she was ready to keep fighting. This version dives deep into the emotional highs and practical steps following Karoline's victory, keeping the tone relatable and engaging. Let me know if you'd like further adjustments. Winning the lawsuit changed Karoline's life in ways she couldn't have imagined. For years, she had been fighting just to survive, to keep a roof over her head, pay her bills, and prove her innocence. Now, suddenly, she found herself with resources beyond anything she'd ever dreamed of. But money wasn't what made this chapter of her life special. What truly mattered was how she chose to use it. In the weeks following the trial, Karoline returned to practicing law. This time, though, she didn't join another firm or chase high-profile corporate cases. Instead, she opened her own practice, focusing on helping people who had nowhere else to turn, victims of institutional abuse, whistleblowers afraid to speak out, and individuals caught in unfair legal battles. Her office was small, tucked away in a modest building downtown, but it quickly became a beacon of hope for those who felt powerless. Every morning, Karoline arrived at work early, sipping coffee as she reviewed case files. Some were heartbreaking. A single mother fighting to keep her kids after being wrongfully accused of neglect. Others infuriating. A factory worker blacklisted for reporting unsafe conditions. Each story reminded her why she had started this journey in the first place. She saw pieces of herself in these clients, the same fear, frustration, and determination to make things right. Word spread fast about Karoline's new focus. People began showing up at her door, some clutching folders full of evidence, others simply carrying tales of injustice they hoped someone would believe. Karoline listened to each one patiently, never dismissing their concerns no matter how complicated or overwhelming the situation seemed. "You're not alone anymore," she'd tell them gently. "We'll figure this out together." Her approach wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal. Having walked in her clients' shoes, she understood what it meant to face a system that seemed stacked against you. That empathy set her apart from other lawyers. Clients often left her office feeling lighter, as if a weight had been lifted off their shoulders. And while not every case ended in victory, Karoline always encouraged them to keep going. "Justice isn't a sprint," she'd say. "It's a marathon. Sometimes you lose a battle, but that doesn't mean you've lost the war." As news of her foundation grew, so did its impact. The organization provided free legal aid to those who couldn't afford it, funded investigations into corruption, and pushed for reforms within the judicial system. Karoline traveled across the country, speaking at conferences and meeting with lawmakers to advocate for change. She knew fixing the system wouldn't happen overnight, but she was determined to start somewhere. One of her proudest moments came when a young woman named Lisa approached her after a speech. Lisa had been trying for years to expose misconduct at her workplace but feared retaliation. "I didn't think anyone would listen," Lisa admitted tearfully. "Then I heard your story, and it gave me courage." Karoline hugged her tightly, promising to help however she could. Stories like Lisa's reminded her why she kept pushing forward, even when the days felt long and the challenges endless. Of course, life wasn't without its difficulties. Fame brought attention, both good and bad. Reporters still hounded her for interviews, and critics continued to question her motives. Some accused her of using the settlement to build a personal empire, while others dismissed her efforts as performative activism. Karoline ignored the noise, focusing instead on the people who mattered most: her clients, her team, and the countless strangers inspired by her journey. She also made sure to take care of herself. After years of non-stop struggle, Karoline realized she couldn't pour from an empty cup. She started taking weekends off, spending time outdoors hiking or reading books she'd put aside during the trial. On Sundays, she volunteered at a local shelter, serving meals to those less fortunate. These small acts of kindness grounded her, reminding her that success wasn't just about achieving goals, it was about staying connected to humanity. Back home, Karoline reconnected with old friends and family members who had stood by her through thick and thin. Her mom often joked that she finally had her daughter back, referring to the years when Karoline had been consumed by the lawsuit. They spent lazy afternoons baking cookies and reminiscing about simpler times. Even her younger brother, who had once teased her relentlessly as a kid, now looked at her with admiration. "You're kind of a superhero, you know that?" he said one evening over dinner. Karoline laughed, brushing off the compliment, but secretly she appreciated the sentiment. Despite all the progress, there were moments when the past crept back, and late at night, lying awake in bed, Karoline sometimes replayed the darkest days of her fight, the threats, the loneliness, the nights she thought she might give up. But instead of letting those memories haunt her, she used them as fuel. Every challenge she faced now felt smaller compared to what she'd already overcome. The media continued to follow her closely, documenting her transformation from disgraced lawyer to national icon. Documentaries aired, profiling her journey and highlighting the ripple effects of her case. Schools began teaching her story in civics classes, framing it as an example of perseverance and ethical courage. Karoline didn't seek the spotlight, but she embraced it when it served a greater purpose. If sharing her experience could inspire even one person to stand up for justice, she considered it worthwhile. By the end of the year, Karoline's foundation had helped hundreds of people navigate complex legal systems, recover stolen wages, and hold corrupt officials accountable. It wasn't perfect. There were setbacks and disappointments along the way, but every success reinforced her belief that change was possible. She often reflected on how far she'd come since those bleak days when she worked odd jobs just to get by. Back then, she couldn't see a future beyond survival. Now she was shaping a legacy, but perhaps the most profound shift was internal. Karoline no longer carried the weight of proving herself to others. She had earned her place, not because of titles or accolades, but because she had stayed true to her values. Justice, fairness, integrity, these weren't just words to her anymore. They were principles she lived by day in and day out. As she sat in her office one evening watching the sunset paint the sky in vibrant hues, Karoline allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. Life hadn't turned out the way she'd planned, but maybe that was the beauty of it. The detours, the struggles, the victories, they had all shaped her into someone stronger, wiser, and more compassionate. And while the road ahead would undoubtedly bring new challenges, she felt ready to face them. For the first time in years, Karoline Leavitt felt at peace, not because she had conquered every obstacle, but because she had found meaning in the fight itself. Justice wasn't just something she sought, it was something she embodied. And as long as there were people willing to stand up for what was right, she knew the world would be a little brighter. This expanded version adds depth to Karoline's post-trial life, emphasizing her growth, contributions, and emotional resilience, while keeping the tone relatable and engaging. Let me know if you'd like further tweaks. Years passed, and Karoline Leavitt's name became synonymous with resilience and justice. What had started as a personal battle against corruption turned into a movement that inspired millions. Her story wasn't just about winning a lawsuit, it was about standing up for what was right, even when the odds seemed impossible to overcome. It was about proving that one person could make a difference no matter how small they felt or how powerful their opponent appeared. Karoline's foundation grew into a national force, helping thousands of people navigate the complexities of the legal system and fight back against institutional abuse. From whistleblowers silenced by fear to families torn apart by unfair rulings, her team worked tirelessly to ensure everyone had access to justice. The organization also partnered with schools and universities, creating programs to educate young people about ethics, accountability, and civic responsibility. Textbooks began featuring sections on the Leavitt case, highlighting how an ordinary woman took on extraordinary challenges and won, not for herself but for the greater good. But Karoline never let success go to her head. Despite the accolades and recognition, she remained grounded, always remembering where she came from. She still worked long hours, often skipping lunch to finish case files or staying late to counsel clients who needed extra support. Her office walls were covered in thank you notes and drawings from children whose lives she'd touched. One note read, "You showed me that big problems can be solved if we don't give up." Another simply said, "Thank you for believing in us." Her humility only added to her appeal. People admired her not because she was perfect. She openly admitted she made mistakes, but because she was real. She laughed at her own jokes, cried during emotional testimonies, and wasn't afraid to show vulnerability. In interviews, she spoke candidly about the darkest days of her journey, sharing lessons learned along the way. "I didn't win because I was smarter or stronger," she'd say. "I won because I refused to quit. And if I can do it, so can anyone else." That message resonated deeply. Strangers reached out daily, thanking her for reigniting their faith in fairness. A factory worker wrote to tell her how her story gave him the courage to report unsafe working conditions. A college student shared how hearing her speak at a campus event inspired her to pursue a career in law. Even skeptics who once doubted Karoline's motives softened their stance, acknowledging the tangible impact of her work. As her influence expanded, so did calls for systemic reform. Lawmakers cited her case when drafting new legislation aimed at increasing transparency within the judiciary. Judges attended workshops on ethical conduct, using her trial as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power. Some critics argued that these changes weren't enough, pointing out lingering flaws in the system. But Karoline saw progress, however incremental, as a step in the right direction. Change doesn't happen overnight, she reminded audiences. It happens brick by brick, decision by decision. Despite her busy schedule, Karoline carved out time for herself and those close to her. Weekends were reserved for family dinners, hikes in the mountains, and quiet mornings spent reading by the window. She reconnected with old hobbies, teaching herself to paint landscapes and experimenting with recipes she found online. These moments of normalcy kept her balanced, reminding her that life wasn't just about work. It was about joy, connection, and finding beauty in everyday moments. Her relationships deepened too. Friends who had stood by her through thick and thin grew closer, knowing they had weathered storms together. Family gatherings buzzed with laughter and stories, the kind that brought tears to your eyes from sheer happiness. Her mom often joked that she finally had her old Karoline back, the girl who loved baking pies and dancing to cheesy songs in the living room. Yet everyone recognized that this version of Karoline was different. She carried scars from her battles, but they had shaped her into someone wiser, braver, and more compassionate. One evening, as she sat on her porch watching fireflies dance, in the twilight, Karoline reflected on how far she'd come. Life hadn't turned out the way she'd imagined as a young girl dreaming of becoming a lawyer. Back then, she thought success meant climbing the corporate ladder or earning prestigious awards. Now she realized true fulfillment came from making a difference, not for fame or fortune, but because it was the right thing to do. She also thought about the future. The fight for justice would never truly end. There would always be new challenges, new injustices to confront, but Karoline felt hopeful. More people were speaking out, refusing to accept corruption or inequality as inevitable. Young activists organized protests, journalists uncovered scandals, and communities rallied around causes bigger than themselves. Change was slow, messy, and sometimes painful, but it was happening. When asked during interviews what advice she'd give to others facing similar struggles, Karoline always gave the same answer. Don't lose sight of why you're fighting. When things get hard, and they will, you'll need something deeper than anger or revenge to keep you going. Hold on to hope. Hold on to the belief that even the smallest actions can create ripples. Her words carried weight because they came from experience. Karoline knew firsthand how isolating and exhausting the fight for justice could be. She remembered nights when she questioned whether it was worth it, days when the world seemed determined to break her spirit. But she also remembered the moments that kept her going. A stranger's smile, a friend's hug, a client's whispered, "Thank you." Those tiny acts of kindness reminded her that she wasn't alone. By the time she celebrated the 10th anniversary of her landmark victory, Karoline had become more than a lawyer or activist. She was a symbol of hope, proof that courage and perseverance could overcome even the greatest obstacles. Schools named scholarships after her, documentaries chronicled her journey, and statues were erected in her honor. Yet none of these tributes mattered as much to her as the handwritten letters she received from people whose lives she'd touched. Looking ahead, Karoline dreamed of expanding her foundation globally, tackling issues like human trafficking, environmental injustice, and political corruption. She envisioned a world where no one felt powerless, where everyone had access to tools and resources to stand up for themselves. It was an ambitious goal, but if anyone could achieve it, it was her. As she blew out the candles on her birthday cake that year, surrounded by loved ones, Karoline smiled. The road behind her had been long and difficult, filled with heartache and triumphs alike. The road ahead promised more challenges, more battles to fight. But she wasn't afraid. For the first time in her life, she felt ready for anything, everything, and whatever came next. Because Karoline Leavitt wasn't just a survivor, she was a fighter. And fighters never stop believing in a better tomorrow. This final part wraps up the story with reflection, legacy building, and optimism for the future while keeping the tone relatable and inspiring. Let me know if you'd like further adjustments.